22 May 1975. Our speaker this morning, Colonel W.P.C. Morgenthaler, U.S. Marine Corps, faculty. Our topic, The Strategy of Coalition War, World War II. This lecture is held at Spruance Auditorium and is unclassified.
Ladies and gentlemen, this week the Strategy and Policy course takes up World War II. Certainly an event of the most extraordinary importance, and one that casts a long shadow across the years that follow. To deliver our background lecture on this topic, I am pleased to introduce Colonel Wendell Morgenthaler, USMC. In preparation for the naval aspects of this lecture, he has been sailing on the Sakonnet River, as usual, fishing in troubled waters. He tells me that he has some surprises in store. Among other things, he hasn't decided yet who won the war. Colonel Morgenthaler.
That was very disappointing. We've had a continuing battle here over the last couple of years on the introductions, and I'd hoped for more. The way it was when I was a junior officer and inspected the mess hall, I would kind of rate that as adequate in quality and sufficient in quantity. Dave certainly does not qualify for the J. William Middendorf Public Speaking Award. Now, if I'd been Dave, what I would have done to introduce Morgenthaler, I would have gone back to the introduction I gave him and said something along the lines, well, now, we civilians on the faculty have written a lot of books and articles. Colonel Morgenthaler hasn't, but I do know that he's read a few. Here's the complete list. Joy of Sex, Marine Corps Operations in World War II, you know. I would also have commented on Morgenthaler's military background. One of his last jobs in Vietnam in 1969 was training a Vietnamese Army regiment that was going to take over the defense of Da Nang. And you know how well he did that job. And finally, contrary to what most Marines say, Morgenthaler desires to be commandant. Now, very few Marines will admit that they want to be the commandant. They might say it when they've been drinking, but never when they're sober. Well, I am partially sober today, and I admit that I want to be commandant, but not for the usual reasons of changing the entire Marine Corps. There's one thing that I would like to do that would be different from what the other commandants do. I would go to my office in the morning, and about 2 minutes before 8, a portly colonel would walk in and kind of bow to me, and I would nod, and he would go over, open the window, and I would stroll over to the window and I'd look out at the Arlington Cemetery and the Potomac River and the Pentagon, and exactly at the stroke of 8 o'clock, Marine Corps, kids, put! And all over the world. All over the world, these guys are going to be trained like Muslims bowing to Mecca. Marines are going to pop to attention. I would nod at the colonel, he would shut the window, waddle out, and the Marines would go back to work. That would be tremendous. Now, there's some problems there. At 8 o'clock in Washington, it's not 8 o'clock everywhere else. Marines in Europe, it's about noon or 1300, would jump at attention and they'd spill the wine. And the guys out in the Orient, it's about 2000. Marines would hop off the tables in the massage parlors and scare the girls. There are some advantages, though. In combat, I would authorize small unit commanders to only designate one guy to stand at attention. So each night, the platoon leader and the gunny would get together and see who was their biggest problem child or who had screwed up the day before. Okay, Smurley, you've got the attention duty tomorrow morning for that nut in Washington. And at 8 o'clock Washington time, he would jump to attention, get about 7 rounds in the chest, and the lieutenant would have one less problem. But I can also see it back in Washington. Some big crisis, you know, in about 2 minutes 8, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would call me and say, "Damn it, Morgenthaler, you know there's an emergency. Close that crazy window and get to the meeting." But enough of that. I would much rather stand up here for the remaining 56 minutes and do little one-liners and talk about the Marine Corps, but we have other problems at hand. Now, most of you believe that the most popular sport in Europe is soccer. Howard Cosell would tell you that. The International Olympic Commission would tell you that. Many people would tell you that. They're wrong. The most popular sport in Europe is overrunning Poland. And we've seen it happen time and again here in our little course. Really, it's not strategy and policy. We teach the history of Poland. And one more time today, we're going to be concerned with somebody overrunning Poland. But today, we will resume our continuing saga of war in the 20th century. Now let's look one more time at the sequence of activity. My main purpose today is to finish using this slide. Dave started out with it 2 weeks ago. He took you from 1914, the preliminaries, to about 1975. Tom spoke about the long armistice. Today, we will discuss the second violent phase, known as World War II, and hopefully I will set you up for next week's block of instruction on the Cold War. Now, sort of in review, I feel that this so-called long armistice, which we choose to call it here, was exactly that. One definition of armistice is a temporary suspension of hostilities by agreement of the warring parties. And I think that's exactly what we had during that period. World War I did not end with the destruction of the German nation, nor the destruction of the German army. The Allied forces did not have to fight their way into and through Germany. This whole thing ended with an agreement to end hostilities. And it wasn't too long before it should have been apparent to everyone that this suspension was only going to be temporary. The major powers, and we know who they all were or are, each in their own way began preparing for future conflict. During the latter stages of the 30s, the French built their Maginot Line. The British, in spite of the naval disarmament, continued to rely on sea power, even though there was a certain amount of good strategic thinking in Britain on the use of air power and armored mobility. The Germans, clandestinely at first and then quite openly, made great advances in land, sea, and air war capabilities. The United States, this long armistice period, from a military point of view, things were somewhat mixed. We remained militarily isolationist, politically isolationist. We had the great debates on air power, and they were good because it brought this new weapon to the attention of everyone, regardless of which side they were on. Our service planners during the interwar period did an excellent job of anticipating future conflict. When we entered World War II, some of our troops were still carrying a rifle that had been developed in 1903, a pistol from 1911, the machine guns from 1917 and 19. Our armor and artillery were very light and very weak. So with that little background, that very brief review, seriously, I do want to accomplish a couple of things. I want to discuss a few key political decisions occurred during World War II and the military strategies which resulted from them. In order to do this, we'll also discuss the war in somewhat of a chronological fashion. Looking at the actual conduct of the war should then provide us with some lessons learned. And no lecture in modern times, the post-Vietnam era, is complete without lessons learned. And we'll try and relate them to some that we, everyone involved, learned from the first violent phase. So let's look at the players. Initially, on the Axis side, we had the two fascist powers of Europe, Germany and Italy. Japan formally joined them in a war in December of 1941. In the Grand Alliance, Great Britain and France entered the war in 1939. China had actually been fighting almost a decade against Japan. Russia started out on one side and then transferred to the other. And the United States, like Japan, formally entered into this thing in December of 1941. Now, the U.S. entry brought everyone all together in this war, although we were not all fighting each other all the time, as will be shown here. One might say that this great war had four sub-wars in it. Now today, I am only going to have time and interest in discussing two of these wars. War number 2 and war number 4. They're the ones that affect the United States most. We'll only mention the other two briefly as they affect the two that we're in. But some people do look at this as though there were 4 wars. Now some scholars say that World War II was an image or very similar to World War I. I don't agree with that. I feel there were several differences, some important, some not. One of the least important was that Italy was on a different side. As Churchill allegedly said to Hitler, "We had Italy the first time, you're going to have to worry about it this time." The war, which began in 1939, was fought in Europe and in North Africa, and later overlapped into the Pacific with our war with Japan. Germany and Japan never were able to link their forces. The real overlap occurred when the United States entered the war, fighting both Germany and Japan. The Russians did not drop out this time. They stayed till the end. One of the major powers was conquered, France, and had to drop out of the war. I feel that the influence of the United States in this war was greater than it had been in World War I. You might even say by 42 or 43, we took charge because of our logistics and military capabilities. There was no central coordination for these 4 wars, although their general guidance was obtained from several conferences, and we did have a combined staff relation with the British. So with that background on the different wars, we'll go ahead and begin and see where it all started. As a result of the Versailles settlement, a very unstable situation had been created in Germany. The so-called war to end all wars might be said to have laid the groundwork for the next World War. The United States did not play a vital role in Europe during the early and middle periods of the portions of the long armistice. The Germans were able to capitalize psychologically on the declaration of their war guilt by the Versailles Treaty. They hadn't been conquered, and they began to feel that the settlement put upon them was unfair. The requirement of reparations payments from Germany, coupled with the sorry state of the world economy after the war, and again in 1929, 1930, and the German loss of industry due to disarmament, all served to create a very poor situation in Germany and make it ripe for internal upheaval. The threat of communism, coupled with a very strong feeling of anti-Semitism, served the National Socialist Party very well. And this Nazi Party began to grow, exploiting these problems, and with Hitler in charge, Germany rapidly became a threat to the security of all of Europe. Hitler began to expand in Europe. Appeasement was tried, and it failed. Austria first, and then Czechoslovakia fell. Poland was next. Only due, I feel, to the various alliances which you know that existed, did Great Britain and France reluctantly enter the war on behalf of Poland. Until the very last minute, the two European powers that might have had an opportunity to stop Hitler and stop the Nazis elected to try and stay out of the war. A long time ago at the instructor's training school at Quantico, they taught me that if you're going to tell a joke during a lecture, it should somehow relate to the subject. So I have a joke that relates to appeasement. It also very vaguely relates to something that Professor Rich said the other day about Hitler's castration complex. But we'll, at the end of the week, we'll try the appeasement joke. There was this newspaper boy, and this one house he went to, every time he delivered the paper, the dog would snap at him. Finally, the dog bit him, and the second time the dog bit him, and after the third time the dog bit him, he went to the lady, and on Thursday when he collected, he said, "Look, lady, if your dog bites me anymore, I'm going to shoot him." She said, "Oh, you wouldn't do that." And he said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm going to do that. I'm tired of being bit by this dog. I'm going to shoot him." So the lady took the dog to the vet and explained the problem, and the vet had formerly been a brain surgeon in the Navy. And he understood our language, and he said to the lady, "Well, let's look at the options. We have two options. I can put the dog to sleep, or I can castrate him." He said, yeah, I don't like either one of those, and I don't think the dog would either. And the doctor said, well, that's your two choices. And the lady said, well, I don't want him to listen to me, so go ahead and option number 2. So the veterinarian did, and eventually she brought the dog home, and he stayed in the house for a few days recovering, and the paper boy wasn't bothered, and then the dog got well enough to put outside, and still recovering, and didn't bother the boy. Finally, the dog was completely well. And one day, as the kid was there throwing his newspaper, the dog ran out and bit him, and the policeman had failed. So the kid reached in his paper bag and pulled out his gun, and pow! The dog. And the lady came running out. Why did you do that? Why did you do that? And he said, well, I told the lady, if he bit me again, I was going to shoot him. She said, gee, you shouldn't have done that. I even went to all the trouble of having him castrated. And the paper boy said, I don't understand that, lady. He was only trying to fight me, not rape me. So, that is the appeasement joke, if anyone would ask. Okay, we talked about the situation in Europe as Hitler began to expand. In the meanwhile, the situation in the Pacific was also deteriorating from our point of view. As I had mentioned early on, Japan had been fighting in Manchuria and then in China for almost 10 years. They signed a pact with Germany and Italy and a neutrality agreement with Russia. When France fell, the government of Vichy gave the Japanese certain concessions in Southeast Asia, which probably encouraged the Japanese to seek more from the United States, Great Britain, and Netherlands. So when finally the United States cut off shipments of steel, scrap iron, and oil to Japan, the die was probably cast for the Pacific War, even though the Japanese chose to wait until their fleet was ready for their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, in discussing this war, as I mentioned, we're going to be primarily interested with strategy. The West European War started in September 1939 after this appeasement policy I mentioned failed. Brought Great Britain and France into the war. Shortly thereafter, the war settled into a stalemate, similar to, but less violent than the great stalemate we had during World War I. But by the spring of 1940, the Germans were ready. Their blitzkrieg struck at Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, through the Ardennes forest into France. The Germans went around the Maginot Line. They had learned their First World War I lesson very well. No long slugging matches in the trenches, no futile assaults. They moved, and they moved with air and armor. Within 9 weeks, France fell, and the British Expeditionary Force had to be evacuated back to their homeland. Now, what was the Blitzkrieg? It was a coordinated attack by air, armor, and motorized infantry on a narrow front, with the combat power concentrated in a very small area. A breakthrough was almost guaranteed, especially since the defenders in this case were weak in armor, anti-air, and anti-tank weapons. Additional infantry would follow through this gap and then expand it. The Germans also employed this tactic in areas where success was probable, not through the Maginot Line, but instead through Holland, Luxembourg, and those areas. One of the few maps you're going to see this year that is legible. The French had only built part of their Maginot Line, down in here. So the Germans went this way, they went this way, they went up this way. The Dutch officially refer to this as the 2-Day War, not the Second 30 Years' War. They call it the First 2-Day War. We got a message from Mr. Schlesinger the other day saying that we completed operations on what he has now designated as the Second 2-Day War out in Cambodia. That didn't work as well as I thought. But this, as I said, this blitzkrieg worked, and within 9 weeks, the Germans were down to the coast, and the British had to evacuate that. Britain was in jeopardy, but for various reasons, Hitler chose not to invade Great Britain. Now, military reasons for his decision not to invade the British Isles include, 1, a lack of appropriate shipping. 2, he didn't even have a plan, like the dog chasing a car. What does he do if he ever catches the car? He felt a need for air supremacy, not just superiority, but more than that. And the German Navy was bottled up. So they got to the coast and they were not really ready to go into England. He also had political reasons for not invading the islands. First, he hoped the British would sue for peace. They had been reluctant to enter the war. Perhaps their lessons from World War I would tell them that they had no business fighting a war on the continent. Maybe they would get out. He either felt or hoped or both that the United States would not be able to provide the support or would not be willing to provide the support to Great Britain which we had done in the past. And with France out of the way, Hitler's major threat became Russia, not England. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 was never a harmonious understanding. Neither player trusted the other very well. That's true of all dictators. So in 1940, when the Russians sovietized Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania up in here, they kicked the Germans out that were up there. Some of the Germans had lived there for a long time. And obviously this upset Hitler. The Russians also seized Bessarabia. Hitler was dismayed and he reacted very violently in the Balkans. Took some action there. And then to end the threat from the east and to gain the wheat fields and the oil over this area, he turned and rather than invade Great Britain, he invaded Russia. And this gave us that lineup that we saw on that earlier slide of who the players were. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Japanese were getting restless. We're now into 1941. France is out of the war. Great Britain is rocking on her heels. The United States has started to aid Great Britain, which required U.S. naval forces in the Atlantic. The time was right for the expansion of this greater East Asia co-prosperity spirit that the Japanese had been talking about. The Japanese attacked possessions belonging to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. In 1941, Japan had about 3 options. They had been fighting in Manchuria and China since the early 30s. They could try and complete that campaign. But what would it get them? Nothing really but a lot of land. At that time, no one was aware of resources that might be in China. They could have initiated a campaign up towards Siberia against Russia. That wouldn't gain them anything unless they could work some deal out with Hitler on support that Siberia itself didn't offer the Japanese much. Or they could get down through Southeast Asia and all those islands trying to get the room and, more important, the natural resources, the tin, the rubber, the oil that they needed. Well, a quick and dirty analysis of those 3 options tells you that it's very easy to pick option number 3, which is what the Japanese did. Singapore fell, the Philippines fell, Borneo, parts of New Guinea, and Pearl Harbor was attacked. The Japanese failed to exploit this with an invasion of Hawaii, and the war kind of settled down, which brings us to 1942, and as the authors say, it's time to turn the tide. So now we'll get into some of these strategic decisions that I talked about, the ones that are required for us now to go on the offensive, us being the alliance of the United States. First was a decision that the overriding aim of the Allies would be the complete defeat of the Axis. This came to be known as unconditional surrender. The decision was never in question. Russia and Great Britain always had it as their goal, and the U.S. agreed in December 1941 that this too would be our goal. Our experiences in World War I showed that defeat rather than armistice would be necessary against the Germans. This armistice, this temporary suspension of hostilities, had not worked. The next choice we have is to really defeat them. Hadn't the Germans rapidly recovered from World War I? Britain and Russia were fighting for their lives, and they knew that the only way for survival was to defeat Germany. They had already tried appeasement. They had tried alliances between Russia and Germany, and neither of these had worked. There's no way they can trust the Germans or Hitler for anything. So it's easy for them to agree that unconditional surrender has to be their goal. By the United States endorsing this policy, we hope to reassure Russia of our support. The Russians were very suspicious of it. Now, there are some who say that the policy of unconditional surrender helped the Germans by giving them a propaganda tool to kind of motivate their people. this may be true. I don't know, and I don't really think it matters. There is no evidence to indicate that Hitler was ever willing to surrender or to negotiate out. I think he gave us only one option, and that was unconditional surrender. Some say we didn't mean it by accepting a surrender in Italy. This, I think, was an expedient to get the Italians out of the war, get the Allied forces up there closer to France. Some say that we didn't mean unconditional surrender when we allowed the emperor to remain on the throne in Japan when that war ended. Again, this was an expedient. Many people feel that we needed the emperor in Japan to control those people, so allowing him to stay didn't violate any of our principles. And the evidence also shows that the massive and unrelenting air attacks against Germany and then against Japan showed that the alliance had absolutely no qualms about destroying those nations, their military might, their industrial might, even their society. So I think there really should be no question about this policy. We all made it, we felt we made it for good reasons, and we all agreed with it. Now, stemming from the policy of unconditional surrender was the United States decision, or Roosevelt's decision, that Germany would be the number one enemy. Our main effort would be against Germany and for the preservation of Great Britain. Now, in spite of the personal feeling of many or most Americans toward the Japanese, because the Japanese were the ones that had initially killed Americans, destroyed our armaments out there, seized some of our possessions, our military leaders and then our civilian leaders realized that Germany was the greater threat to Western civilization. Europe, or Germany first, was the logical strategy. We had a traditional friendship with France dating back to the Revolutionary War, a common Anglo-Saxon heritage with Great Britain. This strategy would support Stalin and his desires for a second front in Europe, and we realized the importance of the European continent and of Great Britain. Should Hitler occupy the British Isles and win in North Africa, what would be next? Perhaps through India and a link up in the Indian Ocean with Japan, putting a belt around or through the British Empire. Would it be possible for the Germans then to move into South America and the Western Hemisphere? We realized that we needed Great Britain as a place from which to launch our eventual invasion of Europe. So everything pointed toward Germany first. People also felt that the threat from Japan to our continent was not as great. We didn't want to lose more in the Pacific, such as Hawaii or Australia or the other areas which we still occupied, but we were much more concerned with the threat in the Atlantic. And the other point, we thought it would be impossible to assist China at this time. So again, all signs pointed towards picking Germany as the number one enemy. This decision was the one, however, which probably resulted in the most problems within our coalition. The Russians immediately demanded a second front by us, no matter how unready we were in 1941, and we were very unready in a lot of respects. The British wanted, particularly Churchill, wanted to begin to work against the periphery of the Axis, or the European portion of the Axis. The United States wanted time to get ready for the main thrust into Europe. What I think resulted from this decision was a combination of these three strategies I mentioned, plus far more action in the Pacific than one would have predicted under a strategy of Germany first. We can't really get into the war at this point without looking first, or looking back even, to the operations in the Atlantic during the period from 1940 on through the early stages of the war into, let's say, 42 or early 43. Regardless of the Japanese successes and the damage wrought at Pearl Harbor and in the Pacific, the war was almost initially lost in the Atlantic, both before we entered and for a short period after we entered. The German submarine campaign was having remarkable success. The British lacked escorts and long-range aircraft to protect the shipping that was going from the United States to Great Britain. It seems as though the convoy system of World War I had been forgotten. In order to preserve Great Britain, which, as I mentioned, we felt was vital to the success in the war, the U.S. step by step became involved in operations in the Atlantic. In 39 and 40, our policy was directed by an overwhelming desire of the public to stay out of the war. We declared neutrality at that time and actually established a neutrality patrol some 300 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean, except around Canada. But the Germans were having successes, I mentioned. So in late 1940, President Roosevelt began what he called a short of war policy. It was designed to keep England fighting, gain time for us to rearm, and at the same time, hopefully, we could contain Japan by diplomacy. And step by step, this short of war policy led us into a little shooting situation with the Germans. We started with Lend-Lease, providing equipment to the British and ultimately the Russians. In order to get this equipment across the Atlantic Ocean, it became necessary to occupy Greenland and Iceland. And we began our own convoy escorting system as far as Iceland. We provided a very unneutral amount of information to the British for them to conduct their anti-submarine operations. And finally, our relations with Germany began to deteriorate, and there were several shooting incidents, including the sinking, among others, of the American destroyer, the Reuben James. It took a great effort on our part to supply Great Britain and Russia. Convoys, patrol aircraft, hunter-killer teams, escort carriers were all required over the 2 years to win this battle in the Atlantic, plus the production of more ships and more goods in the United States than the Germans could sink. In August of 1942, in order to prevent the Japanese from establishing a base in the Solomons, which would cut our lines of communication to Australia, the Army and the Marines occupied Guadalcanal. Now, although at times the situation there was very precarious, the objective was met, and we cut off this Japanese movement to the south. In November of 1942, the U.S. Army invaded North Africa. So here, less than a year after we entered the war, we have begun, on a modest scale perhaps, offensive operations in two parts of the world, in the South Pacific and in North Africa. Now, there were several reasons for our going into North Africa in 1942, and this was a very important decision, one which Roosevelt made contrary to the advice of his military advisors. First, we wanted to prevent Germany and Italy from owning the Mediterranean. Again, we go back to our very important goal of supporting the British and maintaining the British Empire. We wanted to prevent this possibility of a link-up between the Axis forces in the Indian Ocean. We had troops in England and in the United States who were trained and ready but were not fighting. Yet we had a Germany first policy, and so far all of our fighting is being done out in Asia. And Americans are getting killed out there, and the civilians are all against the Japanese. So Roosevelt has to drum up some support for his Germany first policy with the Germans. And he can say, look, those nasty Germans are killing our boys. I was right, Germany first. And as General Marshall said, in a war like this, really, you should do something every year to keep the people interested. So in 1942, there was an opportunity to fight Germans. It happened to be in the Mediterranean, but it made a lot of sense. So that's what we did. It fit into the strategies of the three major Allied participants somewhat. It suited the British because it was part of what they felt would be their peripheral strategy, attacking Europe around the perimeter. It did bring the Americans into combat with the Germans. You might have to stretch a point to say that this was the second front that Stalin had been harping about. But on the other hand, North Africa became the springboard from which we could go into Sicily and then Italy, and eventually it supported his second front desires. Now in the Pacific, our great victory at Midway gave us the opportunity to begin our advance towards Japan. I am not going to go into great detail on the operations in the Pacific because Tuesday's lecture, Professor Kroll, will cover that part of the war. I can't omit it today because it is a vital part of the war, but I don't want to get bogged down into all the islands. I don't want to get into the details of the command relationships and the opposing strategies other than to mention them to you and let him pick it up on Tuesday from that. But as Sam Morrison says, and he's probably as reliable as any other historian on this, there were really 4 roads to Tokyo in 1942. One was through the Indian Ocean, led by the British fleet, which would require the ejection of the Japanese from Burma. Well, this was impossible. The British fleet wasn't that strong. There were not forces available to send to Burma if we were going to defend what we had in the Pacific and concentrate on our Germany first colony. The second road is the short road up there via the Aleutians. That would be a tough way to go based on the weather. So those 2 roads we can close very easily. A third way, and the one that General MacArthur wanted, in general terms, up through New Guinea, all the Philippines, and then perhaps to Formosa or Okinawa, and on to Japan. The Navy strategy, which they preferred, was to go through the Central Pacific. The Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Bonans, up that way. Then on to Formosa, and from Formosa to Japan. I think the resulting strategy, which we ended up using in the Pacific, was the combination of the last 2. We had forces go up through New Guinea and the Philippines. We had other forces go up through the Central Pacific, chopping off some of the islands, bypassing other ones. Either ones that we didn't need or ones that would have been tough to take, such as truck. This strategy which we used was probably the best choice that was available by using the 2. We had, it turned out, the power to do it, the naval power, the air power, and the land power to do it. If we had taken only one route, I think we would have run into greater Japanese opposition by sea and air, because many of the Japanese bases are mutually supporting by air. So when we had the capability of going 2 routes, we ended up with the best choice, the 5th choice from the 4 that were available to us. What we didn't do, modifications came later in the war, which I think Phil will talk about. We didn't go to China. We didn't go to Formosa. It turned out Formosa would have been a real tough one. China, Chiang Kai-shek had been pushed back inland. We wanted the coast of China for air bases from which to strike Japan. They would have been hard to get, and it turned out the bases that we had in Guam, Saipan, and that area were sufficient for our attack on Japan. So we didn't go into China. It was a military decision with subsequent very important political considerations. I'm going to skip ahead to 1944 rather than to go into all the little battles, but by this time the ring had been closed and decision time became near. The United States had been pressing the British for 2 years for a cross-channel attack. It almost came in 1943, and for a variety of reasons we went into Italy instead. The British still wanted to wait until 1945 to go across the channel into Europe. The General Marshal forced the issue, and the invasion of Normandy was launched in June of 1944. It got off to a slow start, but once moving, it went well, with only one setback, the Battle of the Bulge. The Allied forces began to move into Germany from both sides, the east and the west. Stalin now had his second front. We were fighting Germans and eventually fighting them on German soil, and the British could accept this, even though we had only followed their peripheral strategy, or their indirect approach, to a minimum. Now, why not a peripheral strategy? Let's get back and look at that for a moment. Britain, or particularly Churchill, talked about this. I think for the early couple of years of the war, he was never sure of the success of a cross-channel attack. The experience in World War I showed the British the problems of fighting a large land war on the continent. Churchill felt that repeated small attacks in a variety of areas would dissipate the German forces. Perhaps we could secure a lodgment and then expand it. But he talked about Norway. He talked about down here in the Mediterranean. He talked about roads of all places. But that's what he would have preferred to do. Small attacks, medium-sized attacks, extending into 1945 when we could be super ready to go across the channel, unless one of those attacks had secured us a permanent area from which to enter. The United States was against it because we felt that it would dissipate our forces. We felt that it would not be decisive. Churchill kept talking about the soft underbelly of Europe. And General Mark Clark in Italy said that's awful because he had to fight through those mountains. And if you look at the terrain involved, Norway, Greece, Yugoslavia, going into France, I think, and across France would be much easier. And it turned out it would. You compare France with Italy, and you see the difference there in the terrain, our capability to move and move rapidly. So we prevailed on that decision, and in 44, as I mentioned, forced the issue and did go in to France. By the spring of 45, the Allies in Europe had defeated and occupied Germany. Effort could be concentrated on Japan. The bombing campaign was increased, and the success of it, coupled with the 2 atomic explosions, apparently caused the Japanese emperor to sue for peace. Thus ends a very brief discourse on the war. But what does all this mean to us? I think we, in keeping with the course, we'll take a look at some of the political lessons or political consequences of the war, and then, as I mentioned, some of the military lessons. Now, our alliance with Russia and Britain during this war held firm in spite of major problems, such as the Second Front, when to invade Europe, the use of U.S. forces in the Pacific, contrary to our Germany First policy, held together because of one common thread, and that was the desire of all 3 major powers to defeat the common enemy. Many things were put aside so that we could get on with the war and get to the heart of the matter, which was the defeat and the destruction of Nazi Germany. And this resulted in a relatively early victory. By 1945, the war was over. But it also resulted in severe political consequences after the war. The problems we had put aside, particularly what to do with the nations, the conquered nations, now that we have them back, how are they going to be organized and distributed to the war? So it's easy to see why, after the war ended, and this common thread, this common goal of the defeat of the Nazis, resulted in a rapid deterioration of relations between the 3 major partners. But here are, in very general terms, some political consequences of the war. We end up with bipolarity, 2 superpowers, not just great powers or big powers, but a new term, superpowers. And why? France, Great Britain, Germany, Japan have all been hurt, and hurt very badly during the war. So they decline. We get new states out of the post-war settlement in both Africa and in Asia. And as a result of the atomic bomb, we have this specter of nuclear warfare hanging over all of us. And these are the factors which lead really to next week's instruction. The Cold War between the 2 superpowers, where there is no one else with the power to influence us. And it concerns these new sovereign states, and it's conducted under this nuclear context. So these outcomes of the war, stuff for the Cold War. And finally, some of the military lessons, and as I mentioned, related back to the First War. We talked about the indirect peripheral strategy. Anything to be done, try to be done during the Second War to avoid that long slugging match we had back in France. Whether it was naval operations, air operations, armor, whatever. The Germans learned their lesson well on item number 2, the use of armor. When I talk about armor, I'm often talking about supporting air. A lot of people talked about armor between the wars, but the Germans were the ones that put it together in their famous Blitzkrieg, which I mentioned. We found out that fortifications, which was France's answer to World War I, were not all that good. The Maginot Line was bypassed. The fort in Belgium fell very rapidly. Corregidor, with its fortifications, could not be defended too long. Singapore fell in a hurry. Naval thought. And I separate amphibious warfare from naval thought because amphibious warfare is really a combination of both naval and land. But in naval thought, we had the carrier. And we had the support to keep the carriers at sea for a long time. Probably one of the best things that happened at Pearl Harbor was the destruction of the battleship, so that we could get on with using the carriers and forget about the old way. and our long-range fleet submarines, and the role we could put them into as guerre de course. And here we have guerre de course being conducted by the major sea power instead of the lesser sea power, and in the case of our operations against Japan, it worked. Amphibious warfare was practiced by the Marines and the Japanese. They looked at Gallipoli and said, well, that might be a good idea, even though it didn't work. And the planners who realized that if we were going to have a war with Japan someday and saw how big the Pacific Ocean was, it became obvious that islands would have to be seized. So this was new thought. Strategic bombing. And the results of it are a very controversial subject, but it was developed between the wars and used to a great degree during the war, and certainly had an effect on the war. You can argue about the degree of the effect, argue about the typing and things like that, but it was most useful. And finally, the partisan warfare practiced by the various underground movements in the conquered nations, France, Yugoslavia, the Philippines, places like that, provided some real lessons for subversive leaders of the future. And the one lesson, which I don't have one there, it's one of the few times in history when a lesson was learned and practiced during the same war, is the lesson of logistics. It took logistics to support these carriers that went out and stayed for a long time. It took logistics to support our move across the European continent. And we learned that one. We learned that one quickly. And by the end of the war, we had learned it quite well. So I would say these, when we relate back to the first war, are the more important lessons that were learned by both sides, some properly and some not. So in conclusion, if I could quote from Francis Bacon on this war, if we begin with certainties, we shall end in doubts. And if we begin with doubts and are patient in them, we shall end in certainties. And in a lot of ways, that's what happened. We began with certainties. Germany first, unconditional surrender. And as you know, after the war, after 1945, we certainly ended in doubts about what the future would hold. Thank you.